job, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you both for your participation here today and for your service. I want to take us out some 30,000 feet for a minute and talk about cover-ups. But for the fact that the whistleblower came forward, we wouldn't know anything about this. But for the fact that the Inspector General of the CIA found it to be both urgent and credible, we wouldn't know anything about it. Mr. Morrison, you said that after you heard the call, you went directly to the attorneys in the National Security Council and recommended that they be limited access, and they were subsequently put into a special server. The White House has not released any documents whatsoever to this committee. So to you, Mr. Volker, thank you. But for the fact that you, as a private citizen with your own personal phone and your text messages with Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Sondland and Mr. Mayak and whomever else, but for those text messages that we've been putting up on the screen all day, we would have nothing. Nothing. And this cover-up would be complete. That's something we should think about. Now, on July 19th, you had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani at the Trump Hotel, correct? And
that's correct.
In that conversation, at one point, he brought up Mr. Lutsenko, and you said that whatever Mr. Lutsenko is saying, that's not credible. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then he brought up Mr. Biden, and I'm going to quote you here. I've known him for a long time. He's a person of integrity. To Giuliani, simply not credible to me. Joe Biden would be influenced in his duties as vice president by money or things for a son or anything like that. Now, we've had many discussions over the last few days about these investigations into Burisma and Biden and the 2016 CrowdStrike server. And you, in that conversation with Mr. Giuliani, basically debunked all of that. Now, at that time, at that breakfast, who else was with you at that breakfast?
There was someone that Mr. Giuliani brought along. I later learned that this was Lev Parnas, who we've learned a lot about since then.
So Mr. Lev Parnas was at that breakfast that Mr. Giuliani had with you, and we now know that Mr. Parnas has since been indicted for foreign campaign contributions to President Trump's Political Action Committee. Is that correct?
I have seen that.
All right. On May 23rd, you were in that discussion with the president, and at one point he referred to Zelensky having terrible people around him. Who do you think he was calling terrible people around him?
There were two people that came to mind. One of them was a former investigative journalist and later a parliamentarian named Serhiy Leshchenko. Serhiy Leshchenko is someone that in many of these stories is seen as bringing forth a black ledger relating to Paul Manafort's activities in Ukraine. That was one person. The other person I thought it could refer to was the person who was being named as President Zelensky's chief of presidential administration, Andriy Bogdan. He was known as a lawyer for one of the main oligarchs in Ukraine, Igor Kolomoisky, and there was a lot of controversy at the time about him being appointed to the administration.
Do you call them, do you think of them as terrible people?
I don't think either one of them is terrible people, no.
All right, thank you. Mr. Morrison, earlier in testimony that was elicited from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you indicated that others had represented to you that Colonel Vindman leaked. Do you remember saying that?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Colonel Vindman this morning, under oath, said that he does not leak. Now, would you therefore want to maybe rearrange your comments about the references you made to Colonel Vindman?
No, ma'am.
So even though under oath he said that he has never leaked, you believing people who said to you that he may have leaked.
Ma'am, I didn't believe or disbelieve them. I'm merely
But you
relating
then
what they told me.
Well, they told you, and so then you decided to continue to put that forward, even though you had no
No, ma'am.
evidence.
No, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, Chairman, if I could answer. No,
respond.
ma'am, that's incorrect. They, Dr. Hill, Mr. Erath, others in the NSC raised concerns about Alex. Those concerns were noted. I didn't take them for face value. I treated them as representations of others. I was on alert, but I formed my own judgments. I took no action because of the statements of someone else that I couldn't independently validate.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, gentlemen. Welcome to Impeach-a-Palooza 2019, which is the Democratic plan to compel America to impeach President Donald J. Trump through the sheer force of boredom, because it's been a long day. And it turns out impeachment is very boring if you don't have any compelling or any condemning evidence. Good news and bad news. The good news is I'm going to be very, very brief. We're going on 10+ hours of this. I will yield back some of my time. The bad news is most of my colleagues after me won't, so we've still got some time to go. Ambassador Volker, very quickly, do you think that someone should be immune from investigation of suspected ethical or criminal activity just because they were a candidate for office, even for office of the President of the United States?
I don't think anyone should be above the law.
Well, of course not. That would be absurd to suggest that, and I was certain that's how you would answer that question. What if some of these alleged ethical or criminal allegations occurred overseas, occurred in another country? Would it be improper to seek the host country's help, such as we do with Interpol or any other law enforcement agency?
There are channels for doing that for American citizens who may have committed crimes abroad.
Okay. And again, to seek the host nation's their government's help is not unusual at all, would it?
That is correct, and
Thank you.
we often have treaties for that.
Thank you. And again, that's painfully obvious, and to me that's exactly and the only thing that the President was doing here. Mr. Morrison, I want to refer just briefly to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony where he described the 6 people, I believe it was 5 or 6 people, that were in the Situation Room listening to this phone call between the 2 presidents. Colonel Vindman described these individuals as exceptional. He stated that there was no reason to question their integrity or professionalism. This was an exchange that he and I had in the closed-door testimony. Do you agree with the description of these national security staff as exceptional people?
Sir, they are patriots, yes.
People of great integrity and professionalism?
Yes, sir.
Did any of these exceptional individuals, people of unquestioned integrity and professionalism, indicate to you that they had thought that the President of the United States engaged in any illegal or unethical behavior as a result of this phone call?
Not that I'm aware of, Congressman.
Did any of them suggest to you in any way that they thought the President was involved with bribery or any such thing associated with that?
Not that I'm aware of, Congressman.
You know, it only leaves 2 possible explanations. Either these individuals of what we've described as great integrity, either that's not true, which I don't believe, or they just interpreted an ambiguous conversation very differently than did Colonel Vindman. And I have one last thing, just as an aside. As an Air Force officer, I've never understood why President Obama was against providing lethal aid to the Ukraine. Ambassador, do you have some insight into why they refused to do that?
I would only point to the statements from the administration at the time. There was a perception that our allies would oppose it, that Germany would oppose it. There was a perception that Germany should be in the lead. There was a perception that it could be provocative to Russia or escalate the conflict. As I've said extensively at the time and as Special Representative, I don't agree with those arguments. And I believe that the record has borne out that providing those lethal defensive arms was actually very important.
Well, I agree with you, Ambassador. I think that you got it right, and I think President Trump got it right. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I want to direct your attention to a meeting you had with Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Yermak September 14th in Kyiv. Do you recall this meeting, sir?
I believe we had dinner. It was around the time of the YES conference.
Okay. And do you remember discussing with Mr. Yermak Ukraine's intent to investigate their former president, Mr. Poroshenko?
I remember raising the issue of the possibility of prosecutions.
Well, they brought it up. Is that correct? You raised it, and
No,
they
I
talked about
believe
their
that
intention.
excuse me, Congressman, I'm sorry. To be clear, there was a lot of talk in Kiev at that time about whether the new team would be prosecuting the former president. And I had met with President Poroshenko. I had met with others in the opposition as well. And I wanted to call Mr. Yermak's attention to the potential problems of this. I'm very familiar with other examples of countries in the region that have gone for prosecutions of the former government, and these have created deep divisions in society. And so I cited President Zelensky's inauguration speech, his National Day speech from August 24th, that was all about unifying the country. And I cautioned Mr. Yermak to say that pursuing prosecution of President Poroshenko risks deepening the divisions in the country, exactly the opposite of what President Zelensky has said he wants to do.
So it's fair to describe it as you discouraged him from such action.
I discouraged him. I raised concerns about what the potential impact would be.
And what was Mr. Yermak's response?
I believe, and I'm refreshed in this by seeing the testimony of others.
Mr. Taylor,
Mr. Taylor's testimony.
Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent.
Right, and I believe based on that testimony that Mr. Yermak said, well, what, you mean like asking us to investigate Clinton and Biden?
So it was something along the lines of, it's okay for you to ask us to investigate the manner in which you are, these so-called investigations, but you don't want us to investigate our own president. Is that a fair way to describe this?
Well, I didn't quite understand what he was referring to, because to my knowledge, we weren't asking to investigate Clinton or Biden. And so I was kind of puzzled by the remark, and that's why I didn't respond.
Did you go and investigate what he might have meant or ask anybody?
No, I thought I took it something of a deflection from the point I was making about unifying Ukraine.
But in all this time, I mean, Mr. Giuliani in this time, in that May to September, he mentioned the Biden investigation. He mentioned Biden over 50 times and 20-something times in relation to Ukraine. None of that stirred your curiosity?
Well,
You just now finally come to this point?
Yeah, as I testified, I met with Mr. Giuliani once, and he did bring up Vice President Biden, and I pushed back on that. And I maintained a very clear distinction that Ukraine investigating its own citizens and corruption would be fine. Going beyond that to say we're going to investigate the vice president is not fine.
Did you have any discussions with anyone in the State Department or anywhere else in the administration about concerns about the investigation into Poroshenko?
Yes. So I know that I raised this with Ambassador Taylor in advance of that. We had been in some of the same meetings, some of the country team there. I don't remember whether I had raised it with George Kent or Phil Rico or not. I may well have done. But it was something that we had discussed as part of our meetings in Kyiv at that time.
I yield to the chairman.
So, Ambassador, when you had this conversation and you urged Ukrainians not to investigate or prosecute the former President Poroshenko, their response was, oh, you mean like you're asking us to investigate the Clintons and the Bidens? That was their response?
That's what I recall now from seeing Ambassador Taylor's testimony. Yes.
And you didn't understand that at the time, but then at the time, had you read the call record?
No.
Now that you've read the call record, that makes a little more sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
I was curious about something you said earlier when you said that the 2016 conspiracy theory of Lutsenko had no merit, but you didn't see any harm in Ukraine investigating it if they wanted to investigate it. Is that right?
Yes.
Don't they have enough legitimate corruption to investigate without spending time investigating a debunked conspiracy theory?
There's all kinds of corruption to investigate in Ukraine.
But nonetheless, you proposed that they go ahead and do this investigation of something you thought without merit because this was part of an effort to fix the problem that Giuliani was creating?
I did not propose it.
Well, I think you said you were okay with it, or you amended statements, as we've seen, to include it, because, well, if it would help fix the Giuliani problem, was that the the thinking?
Yes, that's correct. If it threads the needle between what is reasonable for Ukraine to do and if it resets the negative perceptions held by Mr. Giuliani and then the president, then why not?
This was part of what you described in your opening statement as your effort to, when you see a problem, to fix it. Is it clear to you now, Ambassador Volker, based on the September 25th call, that you were not able to fix it?
Based on the transcript that was released on the 25th, I can see now that there were a lot else going on that was about Vice President Biden than I knew at the time, and the efforts that I was making were clearly not in the context of what had already been discussed by the President on July 25th.
So it's fair to say you were not able to fix the Giuliani problem?
That's correct.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Ambassador Volker and Mr. Morrison, for your years of service and your professional expertise and leadership on national security issues. And I want to particularly thank Mr. Morrison for his great work on the House Armed Services Committee, on which I serve. I wanted to start with the July 25th call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Mr. Morrison, you were on that call, and there was no mention of withholding aid on the call, correct?
That is correct, Congresswoman.
And there was no quid pro quo, correct?
Correct.
No bribery?
Correct.
No extortion.
Correct.
And Ambassador Volker, I presume you got a readout of the call, is that correct?
Very terse readout, but yes.
In this tertiary readout of the call, Ambassador, from the U.S. participants, was there any reference to withholding aid?
No, there was not.
Any reference to bribery?
No, there was not.
Any reference to quid pro quo?
No, there was not.
Any reference to extortion?
No, there was not.
And I presume you also got feedback from your Ukrainian counterparts as to how the call went. Did they mention the withholding of aid?
No, they did not.
Did they mention any quid pro quo?
No, they did not.
And did they mention any bribery?
No, they did not.
And in fact, the day after the call, you met with President Zelensky. This would be on July 26th.
That's correct.
And in that meeting, he made no mention of quid pro quo.
No,
He made no mention of withholding the aid.
no,
He made no mention of bribery.
no.
So the fact is the Ukrainians were not even aware of this hold on aid. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in the coming weeks, you were in touch with Ukrainians as part of your official duties, and this included talking to Ukrainians over the phone, in person, on text, and the Ukrainians never brought up an investigation into the Bidens. Is that correct?
That's correct.
They never brought up the withholding of the aid.
That's correct.
They never brought up quid pro quo or bribery.
Let me bring up the aid. They did bring that up after the Politico article appeared on the 29th.
I'm going to get to that, but until the Political article,
then, no.
they did not bring it up. And you said in your closed-door deposition, quote, "It never came up in conversation with them, and I believe they had trust in me that they would have asked if that was really what they were worried about."
That's
Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as you pointed out, the Ukrainians never even knew their foreign aid was on pause until the article was published in Politico in August.
That's correct.
So they didn't know during the call.
That's correct.
And in fact, you had to correct Chairman Schiff on this timeline in the closed-door deposition. The chairman of this committee asked you, quote, "When they became aware that military assistance was being withheld for a reason you couldn't explain, no one could explain, weren't they under even greater pressure to give the president what he asked for on the call?" And you answered, Ambassador Volker, quote, "To my knowledge, the news about a hold on security assistance did not get into Ukrainian government circles as indicated to me by the current foreign minister, then diplomatic advisor, until the end of August." Is that your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And Chairman Schiff also got the facts wrong again when he asked you this, quote, "At the point they learned their aid was paused, wouldn't that give them added urgency to meet the president's request on the Bidens?" And you answered, Ambassador Volker, quote, "I think the Ukrainians felt like they are going in the right direction, and they had not done anything. They had not done anything on an investigation," end quote. Isn't it the case, Ambassador Volker, at one point Chairman Schiff said to you, when you were truthfully testifying, quote, "Ambassador, you're making this much more complicated than it has to be," end quote. It's page 127 from the deposition. Is that correct?
I remember that.
But the truth is, the facts are indeed not complicated. And I'm going to close out with two questions for the both of you. Did Ukraine open an investigation into the Bidens? Mr. Morrison.
Not to my knowledge, ma'am.
Ambassador Volker.
Not to my knowledge either.
Did either of you ever have any evidence of quid pro quo? Mr. Morrison.
No, ma'am.
Ambassador Volker?
I did not.
Any evidence of bribery?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Any evidence of treason?
No, ma'am.
No evidence of treason.
With that, I yield back.
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. Mr. Morrison, did Ambassador Bolton want the security aid hold lifted?
Yes, Congressman, he did.
You testified that Ambassador Bolton had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump in late August related to Ukraine security assistance. Is that right?
Sir, can you point to where I testified to that?
On page 266, you said Ambassador Bolton had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump in late August 2019, but the president was not yet ready to approve the release of the assistance. Do you remember that?
Sir, this is 226?
Yes, to 266 and 268. But I'm asking you, did that happen or did it not?
Sir, I want to be clear in characterizing it. Okay, yes, sir, I see.
And
Yes.
you testified to that. What was
Yes,
the
sir.
outcome of that meeting between Ambassador Bolton and President Trump?
Ambassador Bolton did not yet believe the president was ready to approve the assistance.
Did Ambassador Bolton inform you of any reason for the ongoing hold that stemmed from this meeting?
No, sir.
Mr. Morrison, do you consider yourself loyal to the president?
Yes, sir.
And the president executes the foreign policy of the United States, is that right?
Well, sir, I would say he decides.
sets the foreign
He sets
policy.
it, yes, sir.
And as a staffer on the National Security Council, and even someone who serves in the military, it's your job to faithfully execute the foreign policy priorities of the president, is that right?
Sir, my oath is to obey all lawful orders.
On July 25, you listened to the President of the United States talk to the President of Ukraine, is that correct?
July 25th, yes, sir.
And regardless of what you had prepared as far as talking points for that call for the President, you heard the President of the United States ask the President of Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, is that correct?
Yes, sir, he made a request.
And after the July 25 call between President Trump and the Ukrainian President, fair to say that you talked to your Ukrainian counterparts a number of times?
Yes, sir.
How many times when you talked to your Ukrainian counterparts did you ask them to investigate the Bidens?
Never, sir.
Why not?
Sir, it was not a policy objective that I was aware of.
But with all due respect, Mr. Morrison, you're not in the White House to carry out your policy objectives. You just testified that the President sets the foreign policy objectives for the United States, and the one call that you listened to between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine, the President of the United States' priorities were to investigate the Bidens. And I'm asking you, sir, why didn't you follow up on the President's priorities when you talked to the Ukrainians?
Sir, I did not understand it as a policy objective.
Mr. Morrison, I know that you put that conversation in the server because, as you said, you feared the political consequences and some other reasons that you gave. But you also chose to defy the President's request to not come here, as others have, like Mr. Mulvaney and Mr. Bolton. And you have come here, and you've been truthful. And I appreciate that. And Mr. Morrison, whether you acknowledge it publicly or not, I believe that you knew that what the President asked the Ukrainians to do was wrong. And as you just described, your duty is to follow the foreign policy priorities of the President, but to also only follow something that is a lawful order. And I don't think you believe that was a lawful order, and that's why you did not follow up on those priorities. Mr. Volker, we've heard a lot today about this president being such an anti-corruption president. He really cared about fighting corruption. Is Russia a corrupt country?
We're talking about President Zelensky?
Oh, President Trump.
President Trump.
Is Russia a corrupt country?
Yes, it is.
And President Trump has met a number of times in person with President Putin, is that right?
Yes, a few times.
And he's had a number of phone calls with President Putin, is that right?
Yes.
Is Turkey a corrupt country?
Yes, I believe so.
And just last week, despite their corruption, at the White House, President Erdogan had an audience with the President of the United States, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
Finally, Mr. Giuliani on May 9th, told the New York Times, President Trump basically knows what I'm doing as his lawyer. Are you familiar with that statement to the New York Times?
No, I'm not.
But you agree, as someone who has a lawyer sitting next to you, that a lawyer acts on a client's behalf, and only on a client's behalf. Is that right?
I believe that a lawyer acts on his client's behalf. I'm not sure about only on a client's behalf, because I think, as I understood Mayor Giuliani in this case, he was doing a lot that I considered to be on his own. I did not believe he was always instructed.
And when he said we're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, he didn't say I, he said we. Is that correct?
I'm taking that from the statement.
Yield back.
Mr. Hurd.
Mr. Morrison, my colleague from California, suggests he knows your opinions and your thoughts better than you do. Do you have anything? He didn't give you the opportunity to respond. Do you have a response or want to give a response?
No, sir. I heard the president make a request. I received no direction at any time to attempt to lead a policy process different from what I laid out in my deposition. I was directed by Dr. Kupperman to launch an interagency process to ensure a unity of opinion in the interagency as to the importance of continuing security sector assistance, and that's what I did. I acted upon the direction I was given.
Good copy. While we're with you, Mr. Morrison, thanks for your testimony, your clear and sober testimony today. Did you participate in or overhear any conversations about how political information collected by Ukraine on the Bidens would be used for political gain?
No, sir.
Ambassador Volker, same question. Did you participate in or overhear any conversations about how potential information collected by Ukraine on the Bidens would be used for political gain?
No, I did not.
There's been a lot of discussions about a text exchange you had with Mr. Yermak on August 12th that talked about this proposed statement.
Mm-hmm.
And Mayor Giuliani provided some feedback on what he thought needed to be included in that. Did Mayor Giuliani get feedback from the president on what should go into that proposed statement?
I have no reason to think that he had discussed it with the president.
Based on your recollection, Ambassador Volker, who within the Zelensky regime has Mayor Giuliani interacted with? Now, in addition to Mr. Yermak, which we've already talked about, and also the former Attorney General, Mr. Lushenko.
Yeah, I don't know who else he would have interacted with in the Zelensky government. I am aware of him having claimed that he met with Mr. Lutsenko's predecessor as Prosecutor General, Mr.
Yeah, but
Trump.
that's not within
That's not
the
under
current
the Zelensky
regime
government.
in which we're talking about.
I don't know who else he would have met with.
In as few words as possible, what was your understanding of Ambassador Sondland's role in Ukraine?
He cared about Ukraine. He wanted to see U.S. support for Ukraine increased. He wanted to see European Union support for Ukraine increased, including maintenance of sanctions, and he wanted to be helpful.
Was Ambassador Sondland having conversations with senior Zelensky officials without letting other people know?
I don't believe that he was not letting people know. I think he may have had some conversations, but I think he was just acting, you know, and I think we circled back quite frequently with myself, Ambassador Taylor, and others.
Can you say that you have a clear understanding of what Ambassador Sondland and Mayor Giuliani were doing in all their interactions with Ukrainian officials?
I can't say that I had a clear understanding. I thought that Ambassador Sondland and I were working on the same objective, which is getting a meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. And that a statement, as I understood it, that mentioned Burisma in 2016 would be potentially helpful. I didn't know anything more about their interactions or what their thoughts were.
If you didn't have a clear understanding as the special representative of Ukraine, do you think the Ukrainians had a clear understanding?
No, I don't.
You thought there was a difference between Burisma, Biden, and the 2016 elections. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Earlier. Do you think the Ukrainians had similar understanding?
Yes, I do.
There's also a perception that when Ambassador Yovanovitch, who we've all, you know, for her 33 years of being an awesome ambassador, that when she left Kyiv, that the U.S. position on corruption would weaken. That's kind of a narrative that's floating around. Who was the person that took over for her in the interim? Who was the chargé after?
Immediately after Masha was Joe Pennington.
Was this individual strong or weak on corruption?
I would say in line with all the rest of our policy.
And after that individual, who was that person replaced with?
Then that was Bill Taylor.
Who you suggested for that
Yes.
position, correct? Was Ambassador Taylor strong or weak on corruption?
Very strong.
Mr. Morrison, in my last 23 minutes, who sets official U.S. policy?
Sir, the President.
Not some other staffer within the NSC process?
Sir, the NSC staff exists to ensure the President has the full array of options for his decision.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. Is it correct to say that both you gentlemen were either appointed or hired by the White House, by the Trump administration?
Yes, sir.
In my case, by Secretary Tillerson.
But part of the Trump administration?
Yes, serving in the same administration.
Sure. Ambassador Volker, you previously testified that Ambassador Gordon Sondland, quote, "I just know that he had a relationship with President Trump that I did not have." In fact, in one text message dated July 26, you wrote to Ambassador Sondland, quote, "Great photo, Gordon. Can you get this to POTUS without intermediaries?" July 26 was the same day that Ambassador Sondland spoke to the president from a restaurant in Kiev. Is that right?
I'm sorry, the date again?
July 26th.
Yes, I know that to be correct now.
Were you aware of that call?
No, I was not.
Well, this committee certainly is aware of it now, as we all are. Were you aware that Ambassador Sondland had a direct line to the president?
He claimed that he spoke to the president frequently.
Did you have reason to doubt that?
Ambassador Sondland's a big personality and sometimes says things that might be a bit bigger than life.
But he was a political appointee. He was handpicked by the president or somebody in the president's administration to serve in his
Correct.
position.
And I believe that he could speak with the president.
He had also been a large donor to one of President Trump's campaign committees. Is that correct?
I have learned that. Yes.
Mr. Morrison, you stated during your testimony that when you met Ambassador Sondland for the first time, he represented that, quote, his mandate from the president was to go make deals. And in fact, you testified that between July 25th and September 11th of this year, you heard or learned that Ambassador Sondland and President Trump spoke on several occasions. Is it accurate that every time you checked, you were able to confirm that Ambassador Sondland had, in fact, spoken to the president?
Yes, Congressman.
Mr. Morrison, you also testified that Ambassador Sondland emailed you and several White House staff to say that he briefed President Trump in advance of his July 25th call with the Ukrainian president. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Did Ambassador Sondland tell you what he briefed the president on?
He sent me an email, sir. It was a very succinct, it was a list of 3 items. It was a very succinct item with respect to Ukraine. I briefed the president on the call.
And you testified that you personally confirmed that Ambassador Sondland and President Trump had spoken before the July 25th call.
That is correct, Congressman.
And presumably the White House Situation Room keeps a record of those calls.
Sir, that is how I was able to confirm it.
Okay. You separately testified that your staff prepared a briefing memo with suggested points for the president to raise on July 25th, points that were consistent with U.S. policy. Is that correct?
Correct, Congressman.
But the president didn't use those points, did he?
No, sir, he did not.
So I guess let me get this straight. You prepared materials for the president. Your materials did not include references to Biden or the 2016 election. Is that right?
Correct, Congressman.
And then Ambassador Sondland, the guy who is the Gordon problem, the guy who's got a direct link to the president, the guy who's talking about making deals, briefed President Trump. Is that right?
Correct, Congressman.
And then President Trump raised the 2016 election and Vice President Biden and his son to the Ukrainian president after he was briefed by Ambassador Sondland. Is that right?
Correct, Congressman.
It sounds like Ambassador Sondland and the president were on the same page. They both were working to benefit the president's personal political interest, even when that undermined U.S. foreign policy. I want to ask you in the short time that I have, both you gentlemen who serve the United States government, whether, putting President Trump aside, whether you believe that it's proper for any president, now or later, to ask a foreign government to investigate a U.S. citizen, and specifically a U.S. citizen that could be a political rival. Ambassador?
No, I don't believe it is appropriate for the president to do that. If we have law enforcement concerns with a U.S. citizen generally, there are appropriate channels for that.
Mr. Morrison?
I agree with Ambassador Volker, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate both of you being here today. I know it's been a long day for you. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to try and summarize some of what we've heard to shorten this. You were on the July 25th call. Colonel Vindman was on the July 25th call, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
And I will tell you that he testified earlier today that he heard what he thought was a demand on that call that was improper and felt that he had a duty to report that. I think we've established already that he did not discuss or report any of that to you, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
But you did have a discussion with Colonel Vindman about other concerns that he had with the call, and I believe you said the fidelity of the translation and the fact that you both shared a discussion about there not being a full-throated embrace of the Ukrainian reform agenda. Is that fair?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. But with respect to his concern about something improper, specifically, at no point did he come to you and say, I heard something that I thought was improper and was a crime.
Sir, I have no recollection of him doing that.
No bribe, no extortion, no quid pro quo, all the things that Ms. Stefanik asked you.
No, sir.
All right. And as you were listening, did you hear President Trump make a demand of anything that would constitute a crime?
Sir, I've been trying to stay on the safe side of making legal conclusions, but no, sir, I did not hear him make any sort of demand.
All right. You have a law degree,
I do, sir.
so you're at least generally familiar with bribery and extortion, generally.
I'm not a lawyer for the United States, sir.
All right. But is it fair to say that as you were listening to the call, you weren't thinking, wow, the president is bribing the president of Ukraine? That never crossed your mind?
It did not, sir.
Or that he was extorting the president of the Ukraine?
It did not, sir.
Or doing anything improper?
Correct, sir.
All right. And have you heard or read in the media where President Zelensky agrees with you and said repeatedly and consistently that he didn't hear any demand, he didn't hear any conditions, he didn't feel any pressure, he didn't experience anything improper or corrupt on the call?
Sir, I attended the bilat in New York at the UN General Assembly, and he made clear at the time in front of the press that he felt no pressure.
So did anyone on the National Security Council, after this call, express to you that some crime, bribery, extortion, quid pro quo, anything had occurred?
No, sir.
I want to ask you, Mr. Morrison, about the whistleblower complaint. I don't want to ask you to speculate as to the identity, but I want to ask you about the accusations that started this as to their veracity. First of all, the whistleblower, who apparently was not on the call, advised the ICIG that he or she was concerned that the president's conduct constituted under Title 50 U.S.C. Section 3033, quote, a serious problem, abuse, or violation of law or executive order, end quote. Again, to be clear, you didn't hear a violation of law or executive order as you listened to the call.
Sir, I made no judgment about any illegal conduct occurring.
The whistleblower also reported, in starting this inquiry, asserted that that President Trump, quote, sought to pressure the Ukrainian leadership to take actions to help the president's 2020 re-election bid. President Trump does not mention 2020 during the call, does he?
No, sir, I don't believe he did.
President Trump doesn't mention his re-election bid during the call, does he?
Sir, I don't believe he did.
And you did not hear President Trump pressure or have a demand of any kind, as we've already established, correct?
Correct, sir.
The whistleblower, like Colonel Vindman, also uses the word demand.
Did you just say whistleblower like Colonel Vindman? I don't think that's a fact that's in evidence.
Counsel, you should use the microphone.
Thank you, I'm sorry. In all due respect, Congressman, I believe you just said a whistleblower like Colonel Vindman.
No, I said, I'm sorry.
That's not an evidence.
Yeah, the whistleblower, like Colonel Vindman, also uses the word demand. On page 4, the whistleblower asserted, quote, Ambassador Volker and Sondland purportedly provided advice to Ukrainian leadership about how to navigate the demands the president had made of Mr. Zelensky, end quote. Again, there were no demands from your perspective, Mr. Morrison.
That is correct, sir.
All right. So, speculations about the whistleblower aside with regard to motivations, the fact is that the whistleblower was wrong about many of the facts as well. Correct?
Sir, I'm not intimately familiar with the whistleblower complaint, but I did not hear a demand in that call.
I yield back.
The gentleman has expired. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Volker, I want to thank you for being here today, and I frankly found some of your opening statement to be not just genuine, but downright eloquent. In particular, I noted the passages about pushing back on Russian aggression and supporting the development of a strong, resilient, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine, one that overcomes a legacy of corruption, and that this is critically important for U.S. national security. Some of us believe that we're not pushing back strongly enough on Russia. Some of us believe we're not being supportive enough of the Ukraine. But one of our challenges is to go home to the people for whom we work and help explain to them why it is in our national security interest. You have an audience like you'll never have again to look into the camera and tell the American public why it is important to support Ukraine, why it should matter to them if the biggest issue in their life is getting their kids off to school, paying their bills, and the like. Sir.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I agree with you completely that we are not pushing back hard enough on Russia and that we owe Ukraine a great deal of support.
Why does it matter?
Russia is trying to upend security in Europe. It's trying to reassert its domination of neighboring countries, whether it's Georgia or Ukraine or the Baltic states. It has led to war in Europe. The war in Ukraine has left more people dead in Europe in a European war than anything since the Balkans, more people displaced by a war in Europe since anything since World War II. These are people who stand up for freedom, for democracy. They want reform. They want to see their country be successful, like Germany, like Sweden, like us. And they are fighting a war of aggression against them designed to hold them back. And if we want to live in a world of freedom for the United States, we ought to be supporting freedom for people around the world.
Thank you for that. So we're here in part because under cover of a concern for general corruption, some of us believe there wasn't. In fact, there was something quite nefarious as the alternative, that there wasn't a concern about general corruption. But reviewing the record on that, sir, is it not true that in March of this year, the Department of Defense certified Ukraine as having been made sufficient progress to continue to receive military assistance?
I don't know the details of that, but I believe that to be correct.
Is it not true that on April 21st, President Zelensky won an overwhelming mandate with 73% of the vote, based largely on his effort and advocacy for anti-corruption?
That is correct.
Is it not true that this mandate was affirmed and expanded on July 21st when his party won one-party control, again on the basis of anti-corruption?
That is correct.
In fact, subsequently, he enacted sweeping reforms to combat anti-corruption, did he not?
Yes, he has.
And is it not true that everybody on the ground thought, or was filled with optimism, that Ukraine was getting serious about combating corruption?
That is correct.
Ambassador Volker, did you know that one of the very first anti-corruption measures passed in Ukraine was a law to provide for the impeachment of the president?
I did not know that.
It's true, because he thought we should start with it himself. I raise this because my friends on the other side of the aisle keep characterizing this impeachment inquiry as inherently wrong because, and I'm quoting them, it will overturn an election. Over and over, it will overturn an election. Well, impeachment is an anti-corruption tool. And for my friends on the other side of the aisle, yes, it does overturn an election. By definition, it overturns an election. I don't know if they've got a problem with our Constitution and its provisions for impeachment, but I recommend they reread the relevant passages in Article 1, Sections 2 and 3, and some of the history about how we got there. Look, none of us wants to be here, despite what's being said. None of us came to this easily. I didn't. I will recall for the rest of my life the 48 hours I spent at our family cabin, literally plunged in self-reflection and literally prayerful deliberation about this whole matter. Collectively, we're going to have to grapple with this very grave decision. It's weighty, and it's going to get hard, and it's hard in proportion to its importance to our great republic. A republic, if we can keep it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Volker, in the now famous call transcript, the bottom of page 3, President Trump said this: I heard you had a prosecutor and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. Just for clarification, do you believe President Trump was talking about Lutsenko or Shokin?
Shokin.
Shokin. All right, thank you so much. That's what I thought as well. Mr. Morrison, you testified in your deposition that you had issues with Colonel Vindman's judgment. Is that right?
It is, sir.
And you said specifically that you had concerns with Colonel Vindman exercising, quote, appropriate judgment as to whom he said what. Is that right?
It is, sir.
You testified that Dr. Hill, your predecessor at NSC, told you that she had concerns about Colonel Vindman's judgment. Is that right?
It is, sir.
And you testified that Colonel Vindman did not always adhere to the chain of command. Is that right?
I believe so, yes, sir.
You testified that you were aware of issues with Colonel Vindman trying to access information outside his lane. Is that correct?
Sir, I believe I stated that I was aware that there were those who were concerned about that. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. You testified that Colonel Vindman was not included on certain trips. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you testified that colleagues expressed concerns to you about Colonel Vindman leaking information. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, when I asked Colonel Vindman why he didn't go to you with his concerns about the call, even though you, his boss, had no concerns about anything being, I think your language was, nothing improper, nothing illegal on the call, I asked Colonel Vindman earlier this morning why he didn't go to you and instead went and talked to the lawyers, his brother, Secretary Kent, and one other person that he wouldn't tell us and Chairman Schiff wouldn't allow him to tell us. When I asked him why he did that, he indicated that the lawyers had instructed him to do that and he tried to get a hold of you. Is that fair?
Sir, I watched part of the proceedings this morning. I heard him say that. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, one thing that Chairman Schiff brought up at the end of this morning's hearing, he pointed out that you, Colonel Vindman's boss, also went to the lawyers. But your reason for going to the lawyers was a little different, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you had a few things that Mr. Castor and you talked about earlier in today's hearing, but I think at the top of your list was you were concerned about the contents of the call leaking out. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
And that's exactly what happened, isn't it?
Sir, I don't know. I don't know that the contents leaked out. There was a whistleblower complaint. The president chose to declassify the MEMCON.
Well, it seems to me you were prophetic, Mr. Morrison, because you said in your statement today, as I stated during my deposition, I feared at the time of the call on July 25th how the disclosure of the contents of the call would play in Washington's political climate. My fears have been realized. Seems to me you saw what might happen, and it sure enough did. Fair to say?
Yes, sir.
And we get all this. I mean, we get all this, and that's the part that gets me. We get all this, these hearings, these weeks, the basement, and the bunker in the basement of the Capitol, and 4 facts that we keep coming back to have never changed, will never change. We've heard from both of you today that confirm these fundamental facts. We got the call transcript, as you've both said. No linkage to security assistance dollars and investigations in the call transcript. We've got the 2 individuals who were on the call. They've both said no linkage, no pressure, no pushing. We've got the fact that the Ukrainians didn't even know aid had been withheld until August 29th. And most importantly, the Ukrainians did nothing as far as starting, promising to start, announcing they were going to start, investigation, did nothing, and the aid got released. And I believe it got released because of what we've been talking about, the good work of Ambassador Volker and others. I believe that's why it happened. And yet here we are. And you called it all. You saw this coming. That's why you went to the lawyers. That's why you wanted to. That's why the concern was there. And that's the part that's most troubling. I yield back, Mr. Chair. I yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Ambassador Volker, on Daily Mail, they currently have this headline. It says, Ukraine Special Envoy Kurt Volker walks back his closed-door testimony and says he, quote, has now learned there was a link between U.S. military aid and a Biden probe. That's not your testimony today, is it?
I don't believe that's in my testimony.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you. Just following up on Mr. Jordan, the easiest way to avoid investigation is to not do anything wrong. I want to talk a little bit about why we're here. Official government actions can't be traded for help in a political campaign. Let me give an analogy and ask each of you if you agree. Could a mayor of a city withhold funding for the police department budget unless the police chief agreed to open up an investigation on a political rival? Mr. Morrison?
In that hypothetical, no, I don't think he should do that.
Yeah. And Ambassador Volker, sure you agree?
Yes.
And the same would be true if it were a governor withholding the budget request of the state police unless the state police agreed to conduct an investigation on a political rival. You would agree?
Correct.
Yes, sir.
In your view, is it any different for a member of Congress? Of course not, right? Would you agree that the president has the same obligation as the mayor, as the governor, as the member of Congress to not withhold aid unless he gets an investigation into a political rival? Mr. Morrison?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that hypothetical.
I would agree.
Thanks. And we're having a debate here, both sides, as to how to read what's plainly before us, the presidential phone call where the president ignored the work of the advisors in the National Security Council of talking points and instead chose to talk about the Bidens and talk about Hunter Biden and ask for an investigation. So we are just going to have to debate that. But isn't the principle that no person, including the president, is above the law absolutely essential and worth the effort to make certain that we continue to guarantee? Ambassador Morrison?
Sir, I haven't been promoted.
I'm sorry, Ambassador Volker? I'm sorry, pardon me.
Yes.
Yeah, and Mr. Morrison?
Sir, the rule of law is essential to our democracy.
It's so true. You know, we've had some discussions and challenge from the other side that the president has authority in foreign policy to do what he likes. And in fact, he does. You know, a recent president by President Trump to take our troops out of Syria and allow the Turkish forces to go in literally meant that some Kurdish families went to bed Saturday night and woke up Sunday morning, packed their kids and fled for their lives. A lot of people, including both sides of the aisle, totally disagreed with that. But the president has the authority to do it, impulsive as that decision may have been, unwise as it may have been, as threatening to our national security. We're not talking about that here. And Ambassador Volker, I've listened to your testimony and I take it and thank you for making efforts to try to advance what had been a bipartisan Ukraine policy. Help Ukraine get rid of corruption, help resist Russian aggression. But what you came to learn painfully is that there was a sidebar Ukraine policy with Giuliani as the advocate and it appears Ambassador Sondland is very much involved. Is that correct?
I don't know everything about that, sir.
You don't, but as you have been involved and with the benefit of hindsight, while you were working on what you thought was stopping aggression and ending in eliminating corruption, there was a side deal here to get investigations going, correct?
Yeah. So, yes, sir, my objective was purely focused on support for Ukraine,
so
national security, and I now have learned through other testimony about the president's statement about investigating Biden and other conversations that I did not know about.
Right. And thank you for that, and thank you for your candor about Vice President Biden's integrity and service. But the bottom line here is at the end of the day, we're going to have to make a judgment about what the president was up to with respect to that request for the favor and how it repudiated the policy that was the bipartisan effort in Ukraine and raises questions about he, in that hypothetical example I gave of the mayor, held himself to be above the law. I yield back.
Mr. Maloney.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Ambassador Volker, I'm struck by your opening statement. It moved a long way from the testimony you presented to us in October. And I know you gave a reason for that, which is that you were in the dark about a lot of these things. Is that fair to say?
That is one thing, is that I learned a lot out of the testimony of
You learned a
others.
lot.
Yeah.
You learned a lot. And what you said on page 8, I'm referring to your statement that you gave this morning, this afternoon, that I did not know, this is quoting, I did not know that President Trump or others had raised Vice President Biden with Ukrainians or had conflated the investigation of possible Ukrainian corruption with investigation of the former Vice President Biden, right?
Correct.
You didn't know Burisma meant Biden. That's what you're saying.
Right.
Right?
I had separated the two.
I got it. Well, you didn't know, right? I mean, you were, well, do we have to go through it, sir? I mean, you were there on May 23rd for the meeting with the president when he said, talk to Rudy, and Rudy sure cared about the investigations, which you now know meant Biden, right? But you missed it on May 23rd, right?
No, sir. I understood at the time that Hunter Biden and Vice President Biden's son had been a board member of Burisma.
I understand, but you didn't read that as a request to investigate the Bidens at that time. That's all I'm saying.
Correct.
And on July 10th, you were in not one but two meetings in the White House where Ambassador Sondland raised the investigations, but you didn't know it was about the Bidens. That's your testimony, right? At the
That's
time.
right. I did not think he was talking about anything specific.
Right. You heard him say investigations. You thought it was inappropriate, and the chairman asked you about that, but you said, oh, it's because I didn't know it was the Bidens. I just thought it was inappropriate. And then I guess when they were in the wardroom and Ambassador Sondland raised Burisma and the Bidens in 2016, you missed that too, as I understand it.
That is correct.
Right. And then, of course, on July 18th, you knew aid was withheld. And then in August, you spent a good part of the time with this statement with Rudy Giuliani, right? I mean, you were the guy making the changes and interacting with the Ukrainians. You were putting in Rudy's changes, which included a call for investigating Burisma and the 2016 elections, which you now know meant Biden's, right? You didn't know it at the time, right? But now we know it, right? And then on September 1st, you were in Warsaw. I mean, you were at every point in this. You were in Warsaw, and you were there when Ambassador Sondland told Andrei Yermak that he was not going to get security assistance, he wasn't going to get a White House meeting unless there was the investigation. And I understand you missed that, you were out of the loop then.
That's not correct, sir. So I was not in Warsaw at these meetings.
Oh, excuse me, you were not in Warsaw, but you heard about it right after from Sondland, is that right?
No, that's not quite correct either. It was sometime later.
I got it. So, but now we know, right? Now you know what it meant. And you said, in retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections.
Right, that is correct. And
What are the objections you would have raised, sir?
it's that people, what I would have raised is that people are conflating investigating the Bidens with investigating this Ukrainian
But
company,
would you have
Burisma,
objected to the president asking for an investigation of the Bidens, as you sit here now, you said, I would have raised my own objections.
Yes.
If you knew it was the Bidens.
If I knew we were talking about investigating Vice President Biden and asking the Ukrainians
And
to
his
do
son.
that would be inappropriate, and I would have objected to that.
Right, and so if you had heard him ask for it on the call, and you said, in retrospect, Ukrainians clearly would have been confusing, right?
Correct.
Is confusing the right word, sir? I mean, it would have put them in the position of having to do something inappropriate, right?
Well,
Investigate the Bidens.
I think confusing is the right word because they were clearly hearing something different from the president in one conversation and different from me as a U.S. Special Representative. Different
Well, or
from
maybe,
Bill
sir,
Taylor
they
on the ground.
understood that investigating Burisma and investigating 2016, in fact, meant the Bidens, even though you didn't. I mean, in fact, at the time you were talking to Yermak and putting those changes in the statement, he had talked to Sondland, right, at the same time. And so the point being that they were put in an impossible position. They were being asked to do something inappropriate. And you now know that, right? And you would have raised your own objections.
Well, I know they were asked in the phone call to do that. In the conversations that I had with the Ukrainians, we were not asking them to do that. And even at that point, the Ukrainians, perhaps with the knowledge of this phone call, which I did not have knowledge of at the time, they said, we just don't want to go there.
Right. And so in retrospect, though, you would have raised objections. You would have said it was inappropriate for the president to do this.
Correct.
And Mr. Morrison, can I just ask you, sir, so I'm stuck on this issue of you didn't see anything wrong with the call, but you went straight to NSC Legal to report it. Is that your testimony to us today?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Ms. Hemmings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Morrison, and to both of you, thank you so much for your service. Thanks for being here. It's been a long day. Mr. Morrison, just to follow up on the question from my colleague, you responded earlier to a series of questions about the call and basically saw nothing wrong with it. Yet you skipped your chain of command to go to legal counsel to find out, I guess, to find out what to do because you were concerned about the political fallout, not about anything being inappropriate or wrong with the call. Is that correct?
Ma'am, I don't agree with the premise, no.
Okay, could you tell me why you felt the need? You saw nothing basically wrong with the call, yet you skipped your chain of command to go to counsel because of what? What was the reason for that?
I don't know that again, I don't agree with the premise, ma'am. I don't think I did skip my chain of command. If I had seen something wrong, I would have.
Who's your direct report?
The Deputy National Security Advisor.
And the name of the person?
Dr. Charles Kupperman, at the time.
Okay, Dr. Kupperman. Did you speak with him before you spoke with legal counsel?
No. No, ma'am.
But you don't feel you skipped your chain of command in doing so, going directly to counsel?
Ma'am, if I may, I viewed my engagement with the NSC legal advisor as one largely focused on administrative matters. I was interested in locking down the transcript. That's an administrative matter. I was interested in making sure that the legal advisor was aware of the call because I didn't see anybody from the legal advisor's office.
And why were you so concerned about the legal advisor being aware of this call that you saw nothing basically wrong with the substance or content of the call?
Because I did not see anybody from the legal advisor's office in the listening room, and I wanted to make sure somebody from the legal advisor's office was aware, and I wanted to make sure it was a senior person.
And what is it that you wanted them to be aware of specifically?
I wanted them to be aware of the call because I wanted them to know what had transpired.
What concerned you to the point where you wanted them to know what had transpired that you went directly to legal counsel to inform them of?
My equivalent, the head of NSC Legal, was and is John Eisenberg. He was my equivalent in that position. I wouldn't go to somebody subordinate to him. I would go to him.
Didn't you testify earlier that you were concerned about the political fallout based on the political climate in D.C.?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. And so how long have you supervised Lieutenant Colonel Vindman?
Ma'am, approximately, well, I guess not approximately, July 15 to October 31 or so.
Okay, all right, thank you. Ambassador Volker, you testified that you believe congressional pressure helped unfreeze the security assistance being released. Do you still stand by that testimony today?
I believe it was important. I met with staff members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I then saw the letter that several senators signed and sent to Chief of Staff Mulvaney, and I was briefed about the possibility of a couple of phone calls from some senior members of the Senate as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my remaining time to you.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ambassador Volker, just want to follow up on a couple of questions about Ukrainians not being aware of the aid being withheld. You're aware, I'm sure, of the testimony of Colonel Vindman that, in fact, he was contacted by someone within the Ukrainian embassy who was concerned about the hold prior to its becoming public?
I was not aware of that, but I take that.
Are you aware of Ms. Croft's testimony and transcripts that have been released that, in fact, the Ukrainians found out quite quickly after the hold was placed in July that she was impressed with Ukrainian tradecraft and that the Ukrainians had a reason to keep it silent, not make it public?
I saw that in her testimony.
You don't have any reason to question whether, in fact, that testimony was accurate, do you?
No, I don't.
So the Ukrainians did find out before it was public, at least according to these two witnesses. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians certainly found out it was public when it was published in the newspaper, right?
That is correct, in August 29th.
And at the time they found out from the newspaper, they still hadn't had the White House meeting, and they still didn't have the aid. And at that point, they had already had the conversation with the president in which he asked them to investigate the Bidens, correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good evening to both of you, and thank you for your service. Ambassador Volker, on page 7 of your opening statement today, you said, since events surrounding your earlier testimony, October 3rd, quote unquote, a great deal of additional information and perspectives have come to light. I have learned many things that I did not know at the time of the events in question, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
That includes conversations that occurred as well as meetings that occurred of which you weren't a part, correct?
That's correct.
Sir, you obviously were not a part of the July 25th call. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
You were not aware that Ambassador Sondland, according to your opening statement, had a call with President Trump on July 26th, correct?
That is correct.
On September 1st, you weren't present for the sidebar meeting between Ambassador Sondland and Special Advisor Yermak. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And you certainly weren't part of the phone call between Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Sondland, in which Ambassador Sondland, according to multiple people now, said that everything, a White House meeting as well as military aid, were dependent on public announcements of investigations. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And certainly, sir, you weren't part of the phone call on September 7th between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump, in which President Trump insisted that President Zelensky go to a mic and publicly announce investigations of President Trump's domestic rivals. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And certainly you weren't part of the September 8th phone call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump, where President Trump again insists that these announcements have to happen. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Sir, you say that you weren't a witness to any kind of quid pro quo or conditionality between military assistance and investigations, what someone called missiles for misinformation today. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
But sir, you weren't present for many, if not all of the phone calls and conversations where these alleged instances of quid pro quo occurred. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Sir, let me turn your attention to another topic that's come up today. Or actually, it came up last Friday. You have high regard for Ambassador Yovanovitch, correct?
Yes, I do.
I presume that you were aware that as the ambassador was testifying, President Trump actually tweeted very disparaging remarks about her, right?
Yes, I saw that moment.
And I presume that you disapprove of those types of tweets, correct?
Yes, I don't think that's appropriate.
You've supervised many, many people over the years during your career in the Foreign Service, right?
Yes, I have.
And you would never do that to one of your direct reports or anybody who worked in your organization, right?
No, I would not.
It's just wrong.
I believe that even when you feel like you need to criticize, criticism is private, praise is public.
And I also believe that you're a man of honor and you would not attack a veteran. You would not attack someone who is currently serving in the military who's doing their duty, correct?
I respect the service of our members in uniform.
In fact, there's a certain man that we both admire, the late Senator John McCain,
Yes.
who unfortunately was attacked not only when he was alive, but after he died by the current president. Isn't that right?
That is true.
And I presume that you would disapprove of all of those attacks on John McCain, right?
Yes, I knew John McCain very, very well for a very long time. He's an honorable man and very much a war hero for this country.
Well, today, sir, as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was testifying, our president used the official Twitter account of the Office of the President to attack Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's credibility. I presume you don't approve of those types of tweets either, do you?
I was not aware of that, and as with Ambassador Yovanovitch, not appropriate.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for your service, and thank you, Mr. Morrison, for yours as well.
That concludes the member questioning. I now recognize Ranking Member for any closing comments he has.
Thank you. As the first day of this week's impeachment TV marathon draws to a close, I'd like to remind the American people what we're watching. The public hearings are the culmination of 3 years of incessant Democrat efforts to find a crime to impeach the president. First, they tried to manufacture evidence that the president colluded with Russia. To accomplish this task, the DNC and the Clinton campaign worked with the former British spy Christopher Steele. Steele assembled a dossier of false information alleging the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. That dossier was largely assembled from Russian and Ukrainian sources that the Democrat contractors worked with. Next, they primed their hopes on the work of Robert Mueller. Mueller spent 2 years and millions of taxpayer dollars seeking evidence of a crime that we know wasn't committed. Mueller's failure was a devastating blow to Democrats who clearly hoped his work to be the basis for the removal of the president. Today we are witnessing the Ukraine hoax, the direct-to-TV sequel to the Russia collusion hoax. The plot of the Ukraine hoax is hard to follow. It shifts from day to day. First, the Democrats claimed they had evidence of quid pro quo, then extortion and witness intimidation. Now Democrats are pinning their hopes on bribery. Like any good Hollywood production, Democrats needed a screen test before releasing their latest attack on the president. They leveraged the secrecy of the House Intelligence Committee to interview a cast of characters in preparation for these public hearings. With the media's enthusiastic support, they built a narrative based on selectively leaked testimony. Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats on this committee are seeking the truth. They would want to know the answers to the following questions that they refused to ask. To what extent did the whistleblower coordinate with the Democrats on this committee and/or his staff? What is the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign in 2016? Why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden, and what did he do for them? And did his position impact any U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? The American people were promised a grave and somber impeachment inquiry. Instead, they got the salacious spy screen comedy that they've been working on for 3 years. Good night. See you in the morning.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank you both for your testimony today. I would highlight a couple things about what we've heard this afternoon. First, Ambassador Volker, your written testimony in which you say, in hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, you said, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Ambassador, we appreciate your willingness to amend your earlier testimony in light of what you now know. And I think you've made it very clear that knowing what you do today, that in fact the President sought an investigation of his political rival, Vice President Biden, that you would not have countenanced any effort to encourage the Ukrainians to engage in such conduct. I appreciate also that you were able to debunk, I hope for the last time, the idea that Joe Biden did something wrong when he, in accordance with U.S. policy, sought to replace a corrupt prosecutor, something that not only the U.S. State Department wanted, not only the European Union wanted, and not only the IMF wanted, but was the consensus position of the United States national security infrastructure. You didn't get a lot of questions about that today, as other witnesses did, because I think you effectively said that was all nonsense. We appreciate your candor about that. Mr. Morrison, I think what is most remarkable about your testimony is the acknowledgement that immediately after the Vice President met with President Zelensky in Warsaw, you witnessed Gordon Sondland meeting with Andrei Yermak, a top advisor to President Zelensky, and then immediately thereafter, Sondland told you that he had informed the Ukrainians that if they wanted that $400 million in military aid, they were going to have to do those investigations that the President wanted. And you were later informed, and this is also significant as you've testified here today, that the Ambassador Sondland had a subsequent conversation with President Trump and informed you that it wasn't going to be enough for the Ukrainian Prosecutor General to announce the investigations the President wanted. President Zelensky had to do it himself if he wanted to get that aid, let alone the meeting in the White House. Now, you've been asked to opine on the meaning of the term bribery, although you weren't asked to opine on the meaning of the terms high crimes and misdemeanors. But bribery, for those watching at home, is the conditioning of official acts in exchange for something of personal value. The official acts we're talking about here are a White House meeting that President Zelensky desperately sought, and as you have acknowledged, Ambassador Volker, was deeply important to this country at war with Russia, to show the United States had this new president's back. That meeting was important. That meeting is an official act. The military assistance is even more significant because Ukrainians are dying every day in their war with Russia. And so the withholding of military assistance to get these investigations, which you now have acknowledged, Ambassador Volker, was wrong for the President to request, the idea of withholding that military aid to get these political investigations should be anathema, repugnant to every American, because it means the sacrifice not just of Ukrainian national security, but American national security for the interests of the President personally and politically. Now, my Republican colleagues, all they seem to be upset about with this is not that the President sought an investigation of his political rival, not that he withheld a White House meeting and $400 million in aid we all passed on a bipartisan basis to pressure Ukraine to do those investigations. Their objection is he got caught. Their objection is that someone blew the whistle. And they would like this whistleblower identified. And the President wants this whistleblower punished. That's their objection. Not that the President engaged in this conduct, but that he got caught. Their defense is, well, he ended up releasing the aid. Yes, after he got caught. That doesn't make this any less odious. Now, Americans may be watching this and asking, why should the United States care about Ukraine? Why should we care about Ukraine? And this was the import, I think, of the conversation, the now infamous conversation in that Kiev restaurant with Gordon Sondland holding the phone away from his head because the President was talking so loud. What does the President ask in that call the day after the now infamous call he had with Zelensky? What does he ask on that cell phone call? Not whether the Rada had passed some new anti-corruption reform. No. Are the Ukrainians going to do the investigation? Meaning into Biden. And Sondland's answer is they're going to do it. They'll do essentially anything the President wants. But what's more telling is the conversation, I think, that Sondland has with the Foreign Service Officer Holmes afterwards, in which the president says, basically, Donald Trump doesn't give an expletive about Ukraine. He cares about the big things. And Mr. Holmes says, well, Ukraine's at war with the Russians. That's kind of a big thing. And Sondland's answer is, no. He cares about big things that affect his personal interests. This is why Americans should care about this. Americans should care about what happens to our allies who are dying, but Americans should care about their own national security and their own president and their own constitution. And they will need to ask themselves, as we will have to ask ourselves in Congress, are we prepared to accept that a president of the United States can leverage official acts, military assistance, White House meetings, to get an investigation of a political rival? Are we prepared to say, well, I guess that's just what we should expect of a president of the United States? I don't think we want to go there. I don't think our founding fathers would have wanted us to go there. Indeed, I think when the founding fathers provided a remedy, that remedy being impeachment, they had the very concern that a president of the United States may betray the national security interests of the country for personal interests. They put that remedy in the Constitution, not because they wanted to willy-nilly overturn elections. No, because they wanted a powerful anti-corruption mechanism when that corruption came from the highest office in the land. We are adjourned. I ask the audience to please allow the witnesses to leave the room before they exit.
All right,